Hello, my babies. Today we'll be talking about the world's biggest baby, Oathsworn. Just how big is it? Well, it's bigger than my entire vinyl collection, bigger than my entire role-playing game collection, and bigger than my entire wife.
Hello! Don't say collection.
Anyway, this looks stupid. Why in the world are we covering a game where even its own Kickstarter page says you need what I'm pretty certain is a forklift just to get it to the table? No. No, don't say it. Don't you dare say it.
It's really good. Oathsworn flies in the face of everything we here at No Pun Included stand for, but let no one ever tell you that that'll stop us from recognizing a fantastic game. Despite its price and size and mountains of plastic and representation, literally everyone in this game is white, and feminine characters posing like that Parody Avengers poster, I have to admit, this shatters all of our preconceptions and reveals itself to be the smartest design of this entire decade. It's only a 3-year-old decade, but that's not the point. The point is that Oathsworn has absolutely no right to be this good, and yet it is. Let's take a brief overview of what this game is trying to achieve. First, it's one of those grandiose, crunchy tactical fantasy RPG-like experiences. You have your archetypal characters, for example, an archer that's also a tree that fires arrows it plucks from its own skin? Gross! But exciting! There's a bear with an axe, and it's a bear, and it also has an axe. And let's not forget your typical sword dude, who really needs to get out more. Look at him, all dour, could do with a night out. This fella right here though, he goes out too much. Talking of going all out, with most games, tactical crunchy combat, as they say in Yorkshire, that'll do. Oathsworn says, hold my kefir, because we're gonna ferment this baby and then milk it for all that it's got. Not only is there 21 rambunctious scenarios, not only is there entirely separate combat part and story part, each with its own individual rule set, not only is there a gigantic miniature for most scenarios to grace you with its bossness, not only is there a whole writing team with novelists and YouTubers on it, not only are there replaceable weapons for your miniatures, making this the world's first Kindereg dungeon crawler, not only is there an app that reads you the story, but it's voiced by James, I Was the Bear on Game of Thrones, Cosmo.
I'm still on the bit where there are 4 boxes of this thing.
Well, put a pin in that for now.
Why? What are we doing next?
The story? Kill the trees. Kill the trees. Kill the trees. Kill the trees!
There's 2 types of trees in the world. Deciduous, that's the one with the leaves and whatnot, and coniferous, the ones that eat meat. And that is what Oathsworn is made out of. Trees that eat you. You play as the eponymous Oathsworn, an organisation dedicated to keep the evils of nature outside of medieval cities. Your crest is literally a sword going through a tree. And if by this point you're already thinking, what is this anti-environmentalist fear of the outside xenophobic bulldozer? Hold on to that feeling, because Oathsworn will surprise you. I imagine a lot of you want the crunch talk, tell me how combat works, and hey, that's coming, but I think the story part perfectly illustrates how this jumbo jet of a board game subverts expectations by being really smart. The affectionately named Deepwood, the wildlands surrounding Oathsworn cities, is indeed lethal. You're shown that within the game's first few sentences. You're also shown an isolated and scared society. Guards knock on your arms to see if they've become wooden before they let you into the city, for example. For some reason, the ranger that's literally made out of wood doesn't bother them though. No one really understands the Deepwood apart from maybe you, but they know to fear it. I think we've all gotten used to taking board games at face value. The last time a publisher boasted of hiring a novelist to write the game's story, we've ended up with Tainted Grail, a dark reimagining of Arthurian legend. And while some of our viewers were adamant that Tainted Grail's writing was indeed good, I'd counter that it not only profoundly misunderstood Arthurian legend, but we also got a cadre of gruff, stoic, miserable characters in a story that Efka summarised as...
like I was having a conversation with a drunken adolescent who is very passionately explaining Nietzsche.
Yeah, truly very, very dark. Like a single elongated trombone fart.
At this point, all Oathsworn had to do to impress us was not use the adjective dark to describe its characters and locations, but despite leaning into the same themes and tones as Tainted Grail, it delivered with actually good writing in the moment-to-moment stuff and subversions within the big beats of the setting. It did, at one point, use the phrase pregnant silence, but hey, we all make mistakes. Crucially, it understands that to land a grim setting, it can't hammer the same nail like a Sisyphean carpenter. It knows when to let up, let the sun shine in, show moments of cheer or humanity. Every chapter is made up of a story part and then a combat part, and the game uses this dual structure to balance its tone. We've had some whimsical town adventures followed by ruthless combat, and some particularly grueling story moments followed by an easier, slightly sillier tactical confrontation. And sometimes it's just pedal to the metal hard, but by that point, Oathsworn earns it. But what about this xenophobic setting? Well, it's definitely got that frame, but whilst I have to be vague here to avoid spoilers, that's all it is. A lot of fantasy and sci-fi has similar frames. For example, Alien features a ruthlessly corporate universe, but it's what you do within that frame that matters. And whilst you could argue that it's us players that have the agency, and in a game that has multiple moral paths, you could open up avenues for nastiness, I think that the writing team did enough work to show us that that's not what's going on. Or at least, I think they did. We're reviewing this game after a third of the entire campaign. If our opinion changes in the future, we'll let you know. However, there are moments in Oathsworn that do harken back to that idea that edgy, for some reason, means dark, where it thinks it's Game of Thrones, but because it's a board game, it has absolutely no room for nuance, just broad strokes, where it shocks you with deliberate gruesomeness that's less Ari Aster and more Michael Bay via Eli Roth. And when the game, amongst its casts of dozens and dozens, can't offer a single character of color or feminine characters that somehow don't end up being victims, you have to ask, when will board games grow up? I'm waiting very patiently.
Sisyphean carpenter. Efka, just tell me about the mechanisms. Give me the juice, the meat. Feed me like a coniferous tree.
Okay, so shall we do the story mechanisms or the combat mechanisms first?
I think people want to hear about combat.
You're right. Let's do the story mechanisms. The locations and monsters in Oathsworn are sealed away, either in envelopes in the standee version or big lumpy boxes in the miniature one. Here I do have to issue the dreaded very minor spoilers warning, emphasis on the very minor, but honestly you'd be forced to see that stuff by visiting Oathsworn's Kickstarter page, which is the only place to buy it, or by simply reading the rulebook. If the publisher can't teach the game without spoiling the location and monster for scenario 1, neither can we.
And if you want the full spoilers of our adventures in Oathsworn, a bonus video is live on our Patreon now. And if you join our Patreon, we'll mail you this dog!
Most story parts lead your party through a sort of narrative choose-your-own-adventure, but it's more akin to something like Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective rather than Seventh Continent. The very first chapter will lead you to the city of Baston, represented here with a map that honestly looks good enough to hang on a wall. And next to that map, you'll also have a time tracker chart that appropriately tracks the amount of time you spent visiting Baston's scenic locales, like the Stockades, or something called the Underways. Each time you visit a location, you'll learn something new about the mystery you're investigating. Although the real trick is to follow the clues in the narrative and skip the locations that don't directly lead to the solution. When you visit a location, you also take its token and place it on the time track, eventually covering up bonuses you won't be receiving anymore because you dallied too much. Oathsworn rewards paying attention, and the carrot on the end of that stick is combat tokens and potentially extra loot.
Which sounds Okay, until you realise how harsh combat is and how precious extra loot and tokens can be. You'll count your blessings for every last morsel of advantage. And what is genuinely brilliant is that Oathsworn recognises that it's a game of two equal parts, meaning that the expansive story needs something mechanical to reward the players that engage with it. In this way, each part feels intrinsic to the experience. Make good choices, do well, and perhaps you'll squeeze out a marginal advantage that might tip over the scales of combat. If you're careless and make decisions like, hey, this tavern brawl sounds like fun, let's partake, you could end up losing a hit point, and as you only have 6 hit points to start with, you're literally doing the monster's work for it. You might even discover details about the monster you're hunting early, letting you select combat cards knowing more about the foe you'll face. Equally, if you stumble, not only do you have to face a murder machine unprepared, but they might ambush you, robbing you of first round volleys.
There's also a touch of luck where you'll have to pass tests via a card/dice mechanism that we'll cover in more detail in the combat part where it reappears in its grander form. You'll get a target number and you can draw as little as 1 card or up to 10 modifier cards. If you draw 2 blanks, you failed. If you didn't reach the target number, you failed. You can also opt to roll dice instead of cards, which has the same odds, but the card deck offers the delectable dish of card counting. You can mitigate your chances by reshuffling the deck, but at the expense of tokens that you will need for combat later. These tests are few and far between, but they feel more like tense moments rather than frustrating mechanisms of chance. In fact, Oathsworn is very good at not making you feel like it's out there to cheat you. There's no surprise gotcha pivot where the rug gets swept from under your feet. I've played enough story-based board games with a plot twist down the middle where the designers probably thought they were being very clever with an annoying development that I had no way to prepare for because there was no foreshadowing, and now everyone at the table feels stupid and peeved. That's not to say that Oathsworn lacks surprises. Even early in the game there's, and I don't use this phrase lightly, jaw-dropping developments, but they always feel earned and somehow fair despite conforming to the game's somber and devastating tones. And finally, if the phrase "this is a bit like Sherlock Holmes consulting detective" gave you a constipated sense of sitting down and reading a lot to your friends, or worse yet, having your friends do a lot of reading to you, don't worry. The entire narrative is fully voiced by James, I was the bear on Game of Thrones, Cosmo. And let me tell you, James, I was the bear on Game of Thrones, Cosmo, gives it his best. I can't overemphasize what a pleasure it was listening to Mr. Cosmo's performance, with different shades of tone to individualize the myriad of characters, or the pace suddenly ratcheting up in a tense moment, and then a meaningful pause to fill the room with
pregnant silence.
That of course requires an app, which is well implemented, although a function to replay sound clips we already heard without winding entire scenes backwards would be very nice. But you don't have to use it. You can do the reading yourself with 2 mammoth tomes if you're really insistent on not hearing the sultry Cosmo tones.
If 2 paths lie before you, you can either continue your pregnant waffle about board game stories, or you can give the people and me what they want, the combat. You won't have time for both. Give us the combat. Kill the trees. Kill the trees.
All right. I'll do the combat. It's not just detectiving though. Most chapters bring something entirely different, from core drama to wilderness exploration. When you sit down to play
my word, enough words about words. Now for these words, them's fighting words.
Can I talk about how the linearity of story contrasted to something like Gloomhaven?
Shut up! At the heart of every encounter, which is the Oathsworn word for combat, is the monster. In chapter 1, it's a gigantic rat, literally the size of a hovel. Why are you fighting it? Well, I'll leave those details for you to discover yourself. Suffice to say that the length of the story part justifies itself here. Oathsworn meets you on the field of battle with an immediate sense of brutality. Each of your 4 characters, and there will be 4 characters no matter the player count, starts with a maximum of 6 hit points fewer if you've managed to fumble through the story, and this, to our knowledge, never increases throughout the campaign. Mother Mouse, on the other hand here, 30 hit points. Not to worry, you get to go first. Each Oathsworn gets a bank of generic fantasy word action points that they can spend to either move, 1 generic fantasy word action point for 1 hex, or perform some sort of an attack by playing one of their cards, which will have the cost in generic fantasy word named action points in the corner. So far, so simple. You move, play a card to attack, and maybe it has an ability like striking 3 hexes in front of you instead of just 1, or maybe it will let you pick up an enemy or even a corpse and chuck it at another enemy, thereby doing them damage. But there's a catch. Any card you play also has a refresh value ranging from 0 to 3, meaning that as soon as you play it, it will go to the appropriate refresh slot and you can't have it back until it crawls all the way back into your hand. If this were any other board game, you'd think, aha, these cards move 1 space over at the end of every round. No, 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 the cards only move when you play a card to a slot, and then anything that was already there moves 1 space down. And if this were any other board game, you'd think, aha, there's a daisy chain effect where cards move and then they move other cards and they move other cards. Not a chance. You play a card and it might move some or none cards 1 space. And that's it. This sense of frugality towards the players is what makes Oathsworn so frustrating and so darn compelling. When players are done spending animus, or when they just don't want to do anything anymore, it's the monster's turn. What they do is determined by a card drawn from a deck exclusive for that monster, which is normally composed of something bad that happens to you, followed by something worse that happens to you, and sometimes it's appended by a sprinkle of salt, literally rubbed into your wounds. Okay, but since we're trying to outwit one big boss enemy rather than fighting flunkies, you'd think that Oathsworn would give us tools to outsmart it, right? Yes! But each enemy has various body parts: head, shoulders, knees and toes. Each body part has its own hit points, reduce it to 0 and you break that enemy location, meaning that if it ever uses that body part to attack, it loses its best attack die or card. Great, let's destroy its snout, right? Haha, no, see, there's a problem. Every time you break a location, you also trigger the monster's next card, giving it a bonus turn. Can we break 2 locations at the same time? Yes! And then you'll give it 2 bonus turns. Not to mention that the monster deck is tiered, and the more locations you break, the faster it advances through to the next tiers, making it more desperate and more deadly. Each encounter takes on the cadence of where you're poking and prodding. You don't know what's in that deck, so you're taking things slow, but you know it's just going to get a lot more deadly, permeating everything with an underlying sense of dread. Over and over, the story tells you that the Deepwood is deadly, and after the first encounter, you know that to be true.
And just like with the story part, Oathsworn knows that the only way you can maintain that sensation of ragged, downtrodden, beaten adventurers at the most desperate is to balance it with moments of generosity. Combat uses the same card/dice mechanism as tests in the story mode. Each monster has a defense value. Each time you cause damage in multiples of its defense value, you take away 1 hit point from it. So, if a monster has a defense of 2 and I deal it 6 damage and I'm attacking its front arc, I will take away 3 of its snout points. Now comes the tricky part. Unlike in the story mode, there is no target number that I need to hit. My only limitation is my own hubris. My weapon might grant me access to cards/dice that have bigger numbers, yellow, red, and then black, but once again, I can draw as many white cards as I like, up to 10. But if I hit 2 blanks, I miss. Except this time I get to manipulate things and push my luck even further. Remember those token nuts I've been storing for the winter during the story part? Well, in the words of James Cosmo, winter has come, and now I get to pelt them at a giant rodent. Let's say that my axe gives me a red card, and then I decide to draw 3 more white ones. A 1, a miss, a 2, and another miss. Ha! But that's okay. I've got a reroll token. I will spend that, and that lets me redraw any card that I like. That's a 4, and not only a 4, but a crit, which means I get to draw another card, and if it misses, it won't count. That's another crit, and then I draw another 3 off of that. That's a total of 12 damage, 6 now points to the face. How about these nuts, you stupid? I need to calm down. It's all about rhythm. You start the fight prepared, you have a pool of tokens, but as things get meaner, they also get leaner. Your tokens are spent, your animus has run out, you're on your last 2 hit points, and the rat is about to attack you. You could play a card to increase your defense because you've only got a defense of 3 and it's got a way stronger attack than you do, but for that you need cards, and your cards are stuck in your refresh slots. You make a desperate attack, spending your only card and spending your only animus, and then you draw 1, 2, 3, 4 cards. A miss. But wait, you're forgetting about the determination rule. Anytime you miss on an attack, you get a free token of your choice. You realize that the card you just played bumped 3 cards from refresh slot 1 into 0. You choose a battle flow token and then immediately spend it to take all of these cards into your hand. And now not only can you play one of them to temporarily increase your defense, but you've also got another one that will remove the attacker's highest attack value dice or card. And the best part is that these response cards generally don't even cost animus to play, meaning that you might just live. In fact, some Oathsworn players have cleverly caught on that if you want to, you can deliberately draw 10 cards to ensure failure and get a token. I mentioned that you can draw cards or roll dice. Well, you can flip-flop between the two however you want, even in the middle of your roll or your draw. Your roll is your draw. Oathsworn is so full of dials and minutiae that there's always something clever you can engineer, some mechanism you can tamper with to eke out an advantage. Not to mention that you draw the monsters event card before the start of your turn, knowing exactly what it will do, giving Oathsworn a puzzly, pandemic-y feel. That's the board game, not the event. You understand.
And now that Efka has mentioned the dreaded word, that's minutia, not pandemic, let's get into some of the things that aren't so great. You know what I'm going to say. The rulebook. And whilst it's better than other grandiose Kickstarter overpromiser rulebooks, it's still quite murky. In fact, to this very moment, every 20 minutes, like clockwork, we'll...
Wait a minute. How does that work? Let me check the rulebook. Just one sec.
It isn't so much the clarity, just the amount of rules for targeting, line of sight, breaking ties, order of enemy activation, facing, attacking multiple monster locations. And whilst once again, just like with the story, Oathsworn is great at making each encounter feel different and surprising, it also introduces complications that grind things to a halt. Not to mention some rules that patently shouldn't exist. I'm looking at you, facing rules. Get it? Because look, face, because you look with your face. It's a joke? I'll explain it later. Not only do you have to track where every figure is looking at all times, but it's further compounded by clunky monster movement rules that intersect with the tiebreaker north then west rule. It is literally rule upon rule upon rule, and whilst I can't argue that it's irrelevant, maintaining facing matters for large miniatures in terms of knowing which of the mouse's chicken legs I can target, the benefit for tracking the facing of smaller miniatures feels tedious and only becomes relevant if I have a character that has a 1 in 20 card that gives a bonus for attacking its flank or whatever.
So very clearly, this minutia stems from ambition. The game promised a lot on Kickstarter and promises it will deliver. All of them. Great and terrible ones. Check out this playable character roster. So many different archetypes with the rulebook clearly delineating their complexity level. And they all come with their own miniature. And it is a cool miniature, bro. Be ashamed of something? Oh crap. Here we go again.
Just glue your miniatures, Efka. What's the problem?
Well, I would, you see, but you get an add-on called the Armory that turns your character into a Kinder Egg.
Yeah, that looks fun.
Ironically, this actually stems from a rule that is good and refreshing to see in a campaign game. After every scenario, you have to lose one item that you brought into the fight. Want to use your best weapon, and your best armor, and your best trinket? Be ready to lose one of them. There's no out. Best part is if your character goes unconscious, you have to give up 2 items. This transpired into probably my favorite player engineered moment, where Elaine named her characters Axie and Swordy, and very promptly after scenario 1, Axie lost one of his 2 axes, and Swordy was now brandishing a shield and a spear because that's all they had left. Now that's what I call a farewell to arms. Speaking of, Oathsworn taketh with one arm, and with the other it painteth a picture. The new gear cards you get tie in with the story in ways I won't spoil, but I will say that sometimes getting a new card told a story of its own. But then this miniature Kinder Egg stuff doesn't just feel silly, it undermines that storytelling. Which brings us to the mouse in the room. And never has a mouse taken up so much unnecessary space. There's a lot to be said about the size of these 4 boxes, but here's the thing. 2 of them are just taken up by absurd miniatures, and the third is terrain that you won't use because it's annoying and gets in the way. And I know miniature fans will defend big plastic here as part of an experience, and I guess you can put a house on top of it and, oh look, it's Disney. But I have to ask you sincerely, if you enjoy miniature presentation, which by the way, I also do you think that this lamp is good? Genuinely, I love a good mini. Is this a good mini, or is it just big? Because whilst not all of them are the same, this broadly speaks to the quality of sculpts you get in Oathsworn. Is this worth the 2 or 3 extra boxes? The nearly doubled cost in increasingly difficult economic times? The, dare I say it, environmental damage from shipping and manufacturing? The space in your house? I'll come clean. I love Oathsworn. I think it's the most thematically consistent campaign experience I've had the pleasure to engage with. It's smart, smarter than your average board game, and it compels me. But this stuff, nah, you can have it. Except we had to get the second hand, and I didn't realize that it's either the miniature version or the standee version. So there's no standees in my box, and if I want to keep it, and I do genuinely think this is fantastic, I have a decision to make. Do I keep all of this in my house?
Which brings us to our very last point, Oathsworn's flexibility.
I think it's very clear that by now our verdict is a reserved recommendation for the standee version. Not because we don't like miniatures, because that's just not true, but because the game's strengths lie in Oathsworn, and most of the game's weaknesses lie
in Blowthsworn.
It's a pun! Thank you, Discord, for this pun.
But that's just where Oathsworn's flexibility begins. We mentioned that your company has to have 4 characters, meaning that as a solo player, for example, you're piloting 4 complicated dashboards. Except you don't have to. Each character has its full mode or a streamlined companion mode. You can, if you want to, just play with 4 companions. Does this work? Yes. We've also mentioned mixing dice and cards as randomizers. Does that work? Well, sort of. You'll have to draw your own lines to suit your own needs. If you find card counting overwhelming, excise the cards. Dice are swinging, but they've also been responsible for some of the most raucous moments at our table. And we've spent half of this video talking about the story, giving you no ability to skip it, which is where Oathsworn is even better than this channel. You can't entirely skip the story in Oathsworn, but you can run a truncated version that will take you through a few tests, dole out a few tokens, and gives you the general story beats. But I think the narrative is this game's standout feature that separates it from myriads of others. It blends two big genres and pulls it off with aplomb. That is a remarkable feat on its own. But if you don't want narrative, skip it. Although if you're inclined to do that, there's other games out there with excellent combat. I like the combat in Oathsworn, but it's a little bit too clunky to fully endorse it on that alone. But you do what you like. Oathsworn knows that this is your game, for you to have fun. It will meticulously and intricately construct its 21 chapters with attention to detail. Oathsworn is a game that promised a lot, and the miracle is that it achieved almost all of it, with subtlety that goes beyond expectation. I know we alluded to smart design a lot without going into detail on what it is that actually makes it so smart, but you'll just have to trust us on that. Or I'll remind you again, if you want the full juice, a spoilerful chat is available to our Patreon backers. Plus you'll get bonus access to our Patreon-only Discord server, which is community moderated and full of enthusiastic board game people just having a nice chat.
Are we done?
I think we're done.
That's been 3 campaign games we've reviewed in a row. I'm really looking forward to reviewing something lighter next time, like Flamecraft. We're reviewing Flamecraft, right? Right?
We'll probably do both.